The bell above the diner door rings. Clara Jefferson, a black waitress, serves a homeless man a warm meal, his $5 bill barely enough to cover it. She doesn't ask questions. She simply sees a man in need. But when her boss finds out, the consequences are swift and harsh. Clara is fired, humiliated, and left standing in a world that doesn't seem to care. What no one knows is that the man she fed is no ordinary stranger. His past is far deeper than they could imagine. What happens when a single act of kindness sets off a chain of events that no one could have foreseen? The sharp clang of a coffee pot echoed across the empty diner. Clara Jefferson wiped down the counter for the third time, her hands steady, but her chest tight. It was past midnight. Lou's Country Grill was nearly deserted, just the hum of the fridge and the soft flicker of neon against the window. Then came the voice. "Clara." She looked up. Chuck Dalton stood by the kitchen door, arms crossed, lips curled into that familiar condescending smirk. "Yes, sir?" she asked, calm but wary. He motioned toward table 3. "You think this is your personal soup kitchen?" Clara stiffened. The booth was empty now, but the image still lingered, an old white man with tired eyes and dusty boots, quietly eating the plate of food she'd paid for herself. "I covered the cost," she said gently. "It wasn't on the register." "I don't care if you paid with gold bars," Chuck snapped. "That bum didn't belong here. And neither do you if you think this is a charity." Clara met his gaze. "He's a human being, Chuck. He deserved a warm meal." Chuck leaned in, lowering his voice to a hiss. "Let me say this plain. You don't make the rules here." "I do." She stood her ground. "Then I suppose I don't belong here." He laughed dryly. "You're right. You're fired." The word hit like a slap. For a second, the world went still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. "You're firing me for being kind?" she whispered. "No," he sneered. "I'm firing you for forgetting your place." She picked up her coat, held her chin high, and walked toward the door. And just like that, after 23 years in that apron, Clara Jefferson was out in the cold. The night before had been bitter cold. A frost had crept in through the cracks around the windows, and the heater behind the counter wheezed like it was giving up the fight. Clara tightened her cardigan and glanced at the wall clock. 11:42 p.m. Almost closing. She scrubbed the counter with a practiced hand, lost in thought. Rent was due in 5 days, and the tips had been thin. No customers for over an hour. Just the sound of wind outside, whistling low and lonely. Then the bell above the door jingled. She looked up. A tall white man stepped in, cautious and slow. His coat was threadbare, his boots scuffed and streaked with dry Alabama dirt. His hair hung in uneven tufts under a worn knit cap, but it was his eyes that caught her, clear, haunted, exhausted. "Evenin', sir," Clara said gently. He approached the counter, pulling out a few crumpled bills from his pocket. "Ma'am," he said, voice gravelly but polite. "What'll $5 get me in here?" Clara blinked. The cheapest meal on the board was $8.95. She could have pointed that out, sent him away like so many did. But something in her chest tightened. She leaned forward, lowered her voice like it was a sacred secret. "You're in luck," she said. "We've got a hush-hush special tonight, meatloaf, mash, and cornbread. $5 even." His lips parted, stunned. "Are you sure?" "I've been sure of stranger things," she smiled. "Take a seat." While she worked up the plate, Lou, the night cook, raised an eyebrow. She shook her head. "Don't start, Lou man's hungry." She brought the plate over, steam rising from it like comfort itself. He stared down at the meal, then back at her. "You didn't have to." "Maybe not," she said softly. "But I ought to." He gave a small nod. "Name's Elijah." "Clara," she replied. "Nice to meet you, Elijah." He picked up his fork, but before he could take a bite, Chuck's voice tore through the air. "Clara, what do you think you're doing?" She froze. It was the beginning of the end, and she didn't even know it yet. Chuck's voice cut through the warm stillness like a blade. "Clara, what do you think you're doing?" She turned, still holding the empty tray. Elijah lowered his fork slowly, his shoulders stiff. "I paid for his meal, Chuck," Clara said, keeping her tone even. Chuck stomped toward the counter, red-faced, his diner-issued polo stretched tight across his gut. "Doesn't matter if you paid or sold your soul. We don't feed drifters. You know that." "He's not a drifter," she replied. "He's a man. And he's hungry." Chuck leaned over the counter, his voice lowering into something colder. "This ain't about hunger, Clara. It's about you making decisions like you run the place." "I made a decision as a human being." "Well, that's your first mistake." He pointed at the plate in front of Elijah. "Get it off my counter." "I won't," Clara said softly. The room fell quiet. Lou peeked from behind the kitchen window. The two high school kids sweeping the back corner froze mid-movement. Even the old couple at booth 5 turned their heads. Chuck didn't yell. Not this time. Instead, he reached forward, snatched the plate with a sneer, and with a quick flick of his wrist, dumped the food straight into the trash can. A sickening splatter echoed in the silence. Elijah didn't move. His hands stayed folded on his lap. His expression didn't change. Clara stood still, jaw tight, staring into the trash bin as the mashed potatoes slid slowly down the plastic liner. That, Chuck said, dusting off his palms, is how we keep order around here. Clara swallowed hard. That was disgusting. He smirked. And you're unemployed. She blinked. You're firing me? That's right. Grab your coat and clock out. She looked around the room. Not a soul met her eyes. Everyone looked away. Familiar shame burned in her chest. Not her shame, but the kind you carry when good people do nothing. Chuck folded his arms. Maybe you forgot, Clara. You're not paid to care. You're paid to clean tables and keep your mouth shut. She stared at him for a long moment. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. His smile only grew wider. You ought to be gone. And so she was. Clara untied her apron, laid it on the counter with steady hands, and reached for her coat. Elijah stood as she walked past him. Thank you, he said quietly. She gave a faint nod. I wish I could have done more. You did more than most ever would. Without another word, Clara pushed open the door and stepped into the cold. Behind her, the diner door swung shut, and with it, 23 years of service and silence. The door shut behind her with a dull thud, and the night swallowed her whole. The parking lot was empty except for a single flickering light near the dumpster. Clara pulled her coat tighter, the cold biting through the fabric like truth through pride. She walked, slow and steady, across the cracked pavement toward the bus stop, her footsteps muffled by the wind. No one had followed her. Not Lou. Not the kids in the back. Certainly not Chuck. 23 years in that place, and not a single soul had stood up. As she sat on the bench, a stray leaf skittered across the sidewalk like it was trying to get away too. Clara stared out at the dark street, her breath visible in the air, chest rising and falling under the weight of what just happened. She hadn't been fired for breaking rules. She'd been fired for breaking silence. Her voice, however soft, had threatened a man who believed power was his birthright and kindness was weakness. She remembered something her mother used to say. Being black in this country means you have to be twice as quiet just to be seen as half as much. Clara had kept quiet for decades, smiling when she was tired, agreeing when she wanted to scream, working hard for less just to prove she belonged. And now, the moment she chose to act like her compassion mattered, like she mattered, she was cast out. She reached her apartment just past midnight. A tiny one-bedroom with peeling linoleum and a stack of unopened bills on the table. She hung her coat, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep didn't come. She lay there, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow above her. In the silence, one thought returned again and again. They didn't fire me because I did something wrong. They fired me because I did something right. And somehow that hurt more. The next morning, the sun rose with a chill that settled deep in Clara's bones. She'd barely slept. Her body was still, but her mind raced. Past due bills, the silence in the diner, the plate of food in the trash. Everything felt unreal, like she'd been yanked out of her own life. By late morning, she was out again, bundled in her heaviest coat, clutching a worn leather folder with copies of her resume. She'd gone from store to store, hoping someone, anyone, might be hiring. But the replies were all the same. We're fully staffed. We'll keep your application on file. Sorry, not at the moment. At noon, Clara found herself across the street from Lou's Country Grill. She didn't mean to walk there. Her feet just carried her. Habit, maybe. Grief, more likely. The diner looked unchanged. Same flickering neon sign. Same rusty pickup in the back lot. Same silence from inside. But then a sound. Low and distant at first. A rumble. Then louder. She turned her head as a line of military vehicles appeared from the far end of Main Street. Jeeps, transport trucks, even an armored Humvee. They weren't speeding, but they weren't sightseeing either. They moved with purpose. People stepped out of hardware stores, barbershops, and bakeries to watch. The convoy slowed and stopped. Right in front of the diner. Clara's breath caught. Inside Lou's, Chuck Dalton was wiping down the register, muttering to himself about lazy employees and high turnover. When the door opened, he didn't even look up. You can seat yourself, he called. But the diner didn't fill with customers. It filled with boots. 12 Marines entered in full uniform, flanking a tall officer with silver at his temples and command in his step. Colonel James Carter. Chuck blinked, finally lifting his head. "Can I help y'all?" The colonel's gaze swept the room like radar. "We're looking for Clara Jefferson." Chuck hesitated, his voice tight. "She doesn't work here anymore." Colonel Carter didn't blink. "We know." Chuck's jaw tensed. "She doesn't work here anymore," he repeated, louder this time, his voice stiff with false authority. Colonel Carter didn't so much as blink. "We know," he said calmly. "That's why we're here." The Marines behind him stood like statues, disciplined, silent, present. A moment later, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, it was Elijah Carter who stepped inside. Not the tired, ragged man from the night before, but a man reborn. He wore his full Marine dress uniform, polished boots, ribbons and medals neatly aligned on his chest. His posture was firm, his presence unshakable. Chuck's face paled. "Elijah," he muttered, eyes darting from the uniform to the insignia. What is this?" Elijah didn't look at him. He turned to Colonel Carter. "This is the place," he said. "She served me here, treated me with dignity when no one else did." Colonel Carter took a measured step forward. "Elijah Carter is not just a veteran," he said, his voice carrying through the diner. "He's a decorated war hero. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart. He saved more lives than most people can count. And yesterday, he walked into this establishment with nothing but 5 crumpled dollars and a little hope left in him." The diners who had remained silent before now looked up from their meals, startled. "And what did he receive?" the colonel continued. "Humiliation. Disrespect. His meal, paid for by your own employee, was thrown in the trash." Chuck raised his hands, defensive. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't care," Elijah interrupted, voice low but unwavering. "That's worse." A hush fell over the room. Outside, across the street, Clara stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching through the window. Colonel Carter spotted her through the glass. "Clara Jefferson," he called loud and clear. She blinked, uncertain. "Please step inside," he said. "You have our attention now." And for the first time in days, Clara's feet moved, not away from the diner, but toward it, toward the truth she hadn't dared to hope for. Clara stepped through the doorway, like she was crossing a line she could never come back from. The moment she entered, the entire diner went silent. Chuck stood stiffly behind the counter, his smugness drained to a pale discomfort. The colonel turned toward her with a nod of respect, not courtesy but something deeper. "Miss Jefferson," he said, "we heard about what happened here yesterday." Clara glanced at Elijah. He met her eyes, gave a small nod. The colonel continued, "More importantly, we heard about what you did." She folded her arms across her chest, partly to steady her hands, partly to brace herself. "We run a program," he said, "a non-profit dedicated to helping veterans transition back into civilian life. Elijah told us you were the only person who treated him like he still mattered." Clara's brows lifted, uncertain. "Sir, I'm just—" "No, ma'am," he interrupted gently. "You're not just anything. You did more in one quiet act than some folks manage in a lifetime." He reached into his coat pocket and held out a business card. "We need people like you. People with heart. People who see what others choose to ignore." Clara stared at the card. Her fingers didn't move, but her eyes welled with something she hadn't felt in days, possibility. Chuck scoffed behind her. "You can't be serious. She's a waitress." The colonel didn't even look at him. "And yet she showed more character in one night than you have in your entire career." A ripple of murmurs moved through the diner. Clara slowly reached out and took the card, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Everything was changing, and for once, it felt like it might be changing in her favor. Clara held the card in her hand like it was something fragile, something sacred. The weight of it didn't come from the cardstock. It came from what it represented, a door she never thought would open. "I appreciate the offer," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've never worked in a place like that. I wouldn't know where to start." Colonel Carter smiled, just a flicker, not out of pity, but out of understanding. "That's exactly why you're the right person," he said. "You don't need to be trained in policy to care about people. And that's the part we can't teach." Clara looked around the diner, at the scuffed tiles, the laminated menus, and the man behind the counter who had thrown her out like yesterday's trash. Then she looked at Elijah, standing tall and proud in his uniform, the very same man who, less than 24 hours ago, had nothing but a handful of crumpled bills and a quiet dignity. She turned back to Carter. "So this isn't charity?" "Not even close," he replied. "We're building something real. And people like you, you're the foundation." Chuck huffed from behind the register. "This is ridiculous. She's not qualified for anything but pouring coffee." The colonel's expression hardened, his voice sharp and cold. "And yet she did more for a war hero in one evening than you've done for anyone in your entire career." A few heads turned. Someone near the window clapped once, quietly. Another nodded. Clara felt something shift in her chest, like a lock turning for the first time in years. She tucked the card gently into her coat pocket, her voice firm now. "I'll think about it," she said. But deep down, she already knew. The next morning, Clara stood outside a large brick building just off the highway. It was cleaner than anything she'd ever worked in. Glass windows that reflected the sunrise, a flag gently swaying out front, and a sign that read, "Veteran Transition Center, no one left behind." She exhaled slowly, tucked the colonel's card into her purse, and stepped inside. The front desk attendant greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Clara Jefferson. They're expecting you." Clara followed a long hallway lined with framed photographs, veterans smiling in graduation caps, job uniforms, or standing proudly with their families. She paused at one. Elijah. A recent picture. Fresh haircut, standing in front of the same building, holding a clipboard. Before she could study it further, Colonel Carter appeared in the doorway ahead. "Glad you came," he said, extending a firm hand. "I figured I owed it to myself to at least listen," Clara replied, shaking it. Inside his office, Clara sat across from the desk. The colonel gestured to the walls. "You're not the only one who started over late," he said. "Some of us needed a second chance too." He laid out the role: outreach support, organizing veteran services, and most of all, being a bridge between people who felt forgotten and the world that moved on without them. Clara hesitated. "I've never worked in an office. No college degree. No certifications. Just restaurants." "You've got the one thing we can't certify," Carter said. "Heart." That word stayed with her. That week, Clara began shadowing volunteers. She learned to file paperwork, navigate job databases, and sit in on counseling sessions. But what surprised her most was how many veterans opened up, not to counselors, but to her. "You remind me of home," one said. Of someone who listened. And just like that, Clara Jefferson, once cast aside for being just the help, was becoming the steady voice so many others needed. Not background, not invisible, but right at the center of something that mattered. That Friday, Clara stayed late after the center closed. She sat alone in the quiet break room, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching the daylight fade through the blinds. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound. Her hands rested on the table, still for once, her thoughts not. Elijah stepped in a few minutes later, loosening his tie, sleeves rolled up. "You all right?" he asked gently. Clara offered a faint smile. "Just thinking." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "About what?" She hesitated, then said softly, "About how easy it is for folks to pretend you were never there." Elijah didn't interrupt. "They didn't just fire me, Elijah," she continued, her voice low and steady. "They erased me. Like I was never part of that place. Like 23 years of wiping tables, refilling coffee, remembering birthdays, meant nothing." He nodded, listening closely. "Chuck didn't just throw away a plate," she said. "He threw away a woman he never saw to begin with." There was a long pause. Then Elijah spoke, quiet but certain. "I've seen it too. Overseas, yes, but here at home, it's different. It's colder. They act like if they don't say it out loud, it's not real." Clara looked at him. "They never said, 'You don't belong here because I'm black.' But they didn't have to." "You're not wrong," Elijah said, voice tight. "And it's not just the diner. It's everywhere." Clara exhaled, her hands wrapping around the mug. "But I'm here now," she said. "And I ain't invisible no more." Elijah gave a small nod. "You never were. Some folks just refused to see you." She smiled, not from joy, but from something deeper. "Peace. I used to think being quiet kept me safe," she said. "Now I know it just kept me small." And in that stillness, something shifted. She wasn't angry anymore. She was ready. The next day was the center's monthly open house, an event designed to welcome walk-ins, connect veterans to resources, and let the community know they weren't forgotten. Clara stood near the front entrance, clipboard in hand, greeting folks as they came in. She'd done this dozens of times now, but today felt different. She wasn't just part of the welcome team, she was the face people saw first. Midway through the afternoon, as conversations hummed and coffee cups clinked, she noticed a figure lingering just outside the glass doors. A young man, black, maybe mid-20s, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn army jacket and scuffed boots. His hands were buried deep in his pockets. He looked like he hadn't decided whether to come in or turn around. Clara stepped outside. "You all right, baby?" she asked gently. He looked startled at first, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, just wasn't sure if this place was for me." "It is," she said without hesitation. He glanced through the window. "I'm not good at talking. Been out a couple months. Thought I'd be further along by now, but," he shrugged. "It's been rough." Clara gave a knowing smile. "I know that feeling." He looked her in the eye. "You served?" She shook her head. "No, but I've walked through some of the same shadows." The young man hesitated, then asked, "What do they even do in there?" Clara motioned toward the room inside. "They listen. They help. And they don't judge. You take the first step, we'll walk the rest with you." His eyes welled just slightly. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He finally nodded and stepped through the door. Clara watched as a volunteer greeted him, offered coffee, pointed him toward a counselor. Elijah appeared beside her, watching the same scene unfold. "Sounded familiar," he said with a half-smile. Clara nodded. "He reminded me of someone." She didn't have to say who. That evening, as the last of the visitors filtered out and volunteers stacked chairs in the meeting hall, Clara stood by the coffee table, refilling the sugar jar. Elijah approached, hands tucked in his pockets, his usual steady presence beside her. "You did good today," he said. Clara gave a modest smile. "So did you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt full and empty all at once, like the energy still lingered, even after the crowd had gone. Then Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded square of paper. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said. Clara took it, unfolding it slowly. Her breath caught. It was the receipt from that night at Lou's. The one she'd handed to the kitchen herself after paying out of pocket for his meal. The ink was faded, the paper soft at the corners, but her handwriting was still clear. "Meatloaf special, $5. Paid, C. Jefferson." Clara's throat tightened. "You kept this?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded. "That meal was the first kindness I'd received in a long time. I carried it with me like proof that good people still existed, that I wasn't invisible." She blinked back tears. "You didn't just feed me," he said. "You reminded me I still mattered, that maybe I hadn't been forgotten after all." Clara looked down at the receipt again. It wasn't much, just paper and ink, but now it felt like something holy. "I didn't know it meant that much," she murmured. "It changed everything," Elijah said. "Not just for me, for both of us." Clara folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into her purse, right next to the card Colonel Carter had given her weeks ago. She looked around the center, quiet now, but alive with memory. One meal, one moment, and a legacy that was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Clara sat in her modest new office. Nothing fancy, just a desk, a phone, a corkboard filled with schedules and thank you notes. The late afternoon sun spilled across the floor, warming the edge of her chair as she sorted paperwork for next month's intake. The Veterans Transition Center buzzed softly outside her door. Laughter from the break room, footsteps down the hall, someone brewing fresh coffee. Normal sounds. Good sounds. Sounds of life moving forward. Clara leaned back in her chair for a moment, letting it all wash over her. It wasn't about climbing some corporate ladder. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. This job, this place, it had given her something Luz never could. A voice, a seat at the table, and a purpose. Elijah knocked gently on the open door. "Got a minute? For you." "Always," Clara replied with a smile. He stepped in, holding a manila folder and a look of quiet pride. "Thought you'd want to know, young Marcus? The guy you brought in last month. He just got placed at the hardware store in town. Full-time." Clara's eyes lit up. "No kidding. Started today. First thing he did was ask if we had any spare dress shirts." Clara chuckled, her hand over her heart. "Lord, he's gonna wear that tie like it's a medal." They shared a soft laugh, the kind that comes from surviving storms and learning to smile anyway. Elijah grew quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, Clara, they tried to make you small. Tried to make you feel like you didn't matter." She met his eyes. "But look at you now." Clara paused, her voice calm but certain. "They fired me from a job," she said, "but they couldn't touch my dignity." Outside her window, the flag fluttered gently in the breeze. And for the first time in years, Clara Jefferson knew exactly who she was. And she wasn't going back. Later that night, Clara stepped outside the center and stood beneath the soft glow of the porch light. The sky stretched wide and deep above her, brushed in violet, with the last embers of sunset fading behind the hills. She pulled her coat tighter, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she'd carried, and everything she'd finally set down. The center was quiet now. The job fair was a success, new veterans had found their way in, and tomorrow would bring more. But tonight was hers. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling to Colonel Carter's contact. After a moment of thought, she typed a short message. "Thank you for seeing something in me when I didn't." The reply came just a minute later. "We don't leave good people behind." Her fingers hovered over the screen, and then she smiled, slipping the phone away. That was enough. She looked out over the town, the same sidewalk she used to walk as a waitress, invisible, tired, dismissed. But that chapter was closed now. Clara Jefferson had not been rescued. She had risen, on her own 2 feet, with quiet conviction and steady grace. And all because, in a moment when she could have looked the other way, she didn't. She cared. That plate of food hadn't just filled a man's stomach. It had cracked open something much bigger. It had revealed a truth too many forget. Doing right might not always reward you immediately, but it always matters. She stepped back inside, the door clicking softly behind her, and with it came the gentle echo of a truth she now believed with her whole heart. Kindness, when done without expectation, becomes something stronger than charity. It becomes justice. Kindness doesn't just heal others, it restores ourselves. Sometimes, life hands you a moment that doesn't come with applause. No cameras, no headlines, just a choice. Clara Jefferson made hers on an ordinary night. No spotlight, no promise of reward, just a hungry man, 5 crumpled dollars, and a heart too full to ignore him. That one plate of food, it didn't just change his life. It changed hers. Because what Clara discovered, and what the rest of us would do well to remember, is that kindness has consequences. Real ones. Sometimes it'll cost you. Sometimes it'll break something that needed breaking, like silence or complacency or fear. She didn't know Elijah Carter was a war hero. She didn't know that her act of compassion would echo all the way to the steps of the Veteran Transition Center. She didn't need to, because she wasn't helping him for recognition. She was helping him because it was right. And here's the hard truth most folks learn with age. Doing the right thing won't always be popular or profitable. Clara lost her job that night. She was humiliated in front of strangers, cast out by a man who saw her as replaceable. But Clara wasn't replaceable. She was remarkable. And it took that moment of loss, of being fired and forgotten, to reveal something that had always been true. She mattered. Not because she wore a title, not because she earned a paycheck, but because she led with heart. And in a world growing louder, meaner, and faster by the day, that's the kind of courage we need. She could have looked away. She could have said, "It's not my problem." But she didn't, because deep down, Clara understood what many forget. Kindness is not weakness. It is strength, the kind that endures when the world turns cold. It reminds people like Elijah they are not invisible. It teaches young veterans like Marcus that someone still sees their worth. And maybe most of all, it shows people like Clara herself that no one can fire your dignity. So if there's a lesson in Clara's story, it's this. You don't need a uniform to serve. You don't need a platform to lead. And you sure don't need permission to do what's right. Because the quietest acts of decency, they often carry the loudest legacy. And sometimes, just sometimes, a warm plate of food is the start of a revolution. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment when someone chose kindness over convenience, and it changed everything? Whether it was a small gesture or a life-altering decision, share your story below. How do you think ordinary people like Clara can create extraordinary impact in today's divided world?